Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have this joint meeting. We've got three very distinguished speakers with unique insights to these two wonderful writers. I don't wish to take up any more of the time other than, as I say, to formally welcome you and introduce Kenneth Blackwell, who's going to give the first presentation. Over to you, Kenneth.
We don't know when the anti-totalitarian Bertrand Russell started reading that great anti-totalitarian George Orwell, but it is clear that Orwell himself was well read in Russell's writings and in his political and religious positions. Orwell read several books published by Russell in the 1930s, which deal with utopian aims. He reviewed Power favorably, but with a criticism that became a feature of 1984. In Power, Russell had deprecated rulers who encouraged ignorance, for he expected that their societies would not survive. But ignorance, according to Orwell, doesn't prove that a slave society will be unstable. The rulers can, quote, deceive their followers without deceiving themselves. It was a long time before Russell discarded this delusion in relation to Stalin, and Russell despised delusion, especially self-delusion. Orwell saw Russell, quite truly, as holding very different political views over the years, and that his vision of the future, quote, has been almost uniformly pessimistic, unquote. Russell, too, wrote that Orwell lost hope. I don't think either is fair to the other. And as Russell's later years showed, his various anti-nuclear and anti-imperialist campaigns manifested hope. A new comment by Russell on Orwell recently came to light. Here is Russell at age 93 in a filmed interview in 1965. Orwell, I think, was a much more just man than either Bernard Shaw or T.S. Eliot. He foresaw the future and dreaded it, and since he wrote 1984, the world has marched on step by step towards that end and is getting very near it. And I think we shall be there completely presently, and then the human race will perish. That is not my firm conviction, Russell said. I hope to be able to see that many people combined will be able to avert that, but that is the way the world is going at the moment. And I think Orwell did very valuable work in his writing 1984. And I liked an earlier work of his, Animal Farm, even better. It was a very good piece of work. Their personal meetings were rare. Russell told David Astor that he met Orwell only once or twice in numerous company. They did, however, arrange by letter to meet for lunch at the time of the manifesto, the manifesto to start a human rights organization. It was to be at the Ritz in London on the 12th of February, 1946, 2 days before Orwell's Critical Essays was published. As Russell was often ill in early 1946, and as his wife, Patricia, tried to commit suicide on the 28th of January, I've been unable to confirm that the lunch took place. If only a celebrity photographer had been present. As for more correspondence, Sonia Orwell had 2 letters from Russell to Orwell, dated in the summer of 1945. She had them in front of her. The 2 letters had vanished without a trace. At this time, the political background of both Orwell and Russell was similar. Both were left-wing but anti-Stalinist. In view of Russia's gigantic success in defeating the Nazis in the East, this was an unpopular stance. They and Arthur Koestler wanted to issue a warning to the West about Soviet totalitarianism. Orwell talked about the organization that they had in mind with various people. Apparently Koestler, to whom Orwell had sent a draft of the manifesto, was to produce a well-typed version. Koestler had already discussed the idea for a league with Russell. Russell was lukewarm because he wanted immediate political action. A conference was duly arranged by Koestler for North Wales, but it didn't take place because funding was withdrawn by the owner of Polemic, to which magazine to which many who were involved were contributing. It was Koestler who seems to have come up with the idea of a second document, a petition. It would feature the notion of, quote, psychological disarmament, on which he was publishing an article in the New York Times and Tribune on the 10th of March. Russell and he negotiated revisions to the petition. In Koestler's autobiography, Stranger on the Square, which was not published until 1984, he refers to Orwell's original draft as having been subjected to various modifications to satisfy the objections raised by prospective signatories. I have not found evidence of such modifications. I've only ever seen one version of the manifesto. Koestler seems to mean not the manifesto, but the petition. I've seen only one original version of the manifesto, which Orwell sent Koestler on the 2nd of January, 1946. However, Smith, in his George Orwell Illustrated, claims to have discovered the manifesto, which he claims Russell and Koestler both signed. I've never seen a signed copy. And I wrote to the Houghton Library at Harvard to get the copy that Smith evidently saw. Crick's 1980 biography of Orwell mentions the manifesto, and Hamilton's biography of Koestler quotes from it. But it is true that the document escaped Davidson's fine net in his superb edition of Orwell's collected nonfiction. There were, however, copies in the Edinburgh collection of Koestler's papers and in the Orwell archive. Smith's quoting of the text has discrepancies. Matthew Chambers found that Smith printed, quote, political terrorism, when Orwell had just mentioned political opposition in the opening paragraph, when instead of political terrorism, Orwell had written police terrorism. Both Orwell and Russell warned against the power of the police in democratic countries. I imagine that the reading police terrorism is correct. The petition may have been conceived as a replacement for the manifesto. The petition seems independent, however. In Koestler's article on psychological disarmament, there were 5 lettered demands. By the time of the penultimate version of the petition, some of the 5 had changed and the number had grown to 7. In the heavily revised draft that Koestler sent Russell following their meeting to negotiate the final text, and Patricia's own meeting with Koestler, the 7th demand had been deleted. It contained the hoped-for effect on material disarmament. Koestler said in retrospect that Russell, through his plenipotentiary Patricia, objected to the mixing of psychological and territorial concessions, and that the press agencies Reuters and TASS would hardly exchange neutral factual summaries of events for presentation to the other side. This is true to Russell's letter of the 3rd of May to Koestler. Koestler says that the substitution of a few words would have satisfied both parties. It didn't happen. There is an acrimonious exchange. And yet, within a few weeks, the two couples, Koestler and Mamaine Paget, his second wife, and Russell and Patricia were back having dinner together. There is talk in June 1946, I believe, of having copies of the document ronioed or mimeographed. We don't know whether this document consisted of the manifesto, the petition, or both. The attempt at collaboration ends in May, when Russell reverts to what he calls his earlier opinion that, quote, men who are writers do better work as individuals than by collaborating in groups. That's on the 13th of May. It must be said that Russell abandoned this opinion when he felt the need for the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955, Hugwash in 1956, C&D in 1957, the Committee of 100 in 1960, and the International War Crimes Tribunal on Vietnam in 1966. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting. Could I pass it on to Ariane now, please? You unmute yourself, please.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. I've been asked to take part in this discussion because Arthur Koestler was my uncle by marriage. So his second wife, Mame Paget, was my aunt, my mother's identical twin sister. And I knew Arthur very well. Indeed, my aunt died in 1954, as you probably all know, but he subsequently became very, very close to, I had always been very close to her sister, my mother, and remained so throughout the rest of his life. So we saw a great deal of him. And I'm really going to talk about the Christmas when my mother, Celia Paget, was invited up with Orwell to stay with the Koestlers in their farmhouse in the wilds of Snowdonia. It was a very remote place indeed. And they'd only moved up there and settled in September of that year, 1945. And Koestler and Orwell obviously were tremendously, they weren't so much close friends as great collaborators, both absolutely anti-Stalinists, both men of the left. And so Arthur asked George Orwell up to stay with him, partly to discuss this manifesto, which at that point they were talking of as the Manifesto for the League for the Preservation of the Freedom and Dignity of Man. And at the same time, he invited my mother, Celia, and of course, George brought his little boy, Richard, who was then 18 months old. And the four of them plus Richard spent a very busy, warm Christmas together. Arthur Koestler was not keen on children, and apparently Richard turned the house upside down, driving Arthur Koestler completely mad. But anyway, during that Christmas, Arthur Koestler and George Orwell went on long walks together to discuss what form this manifesto should take. I've got a few photos here of the protagonists. So that is Mame Paget, my aunt, married. Well, she didn't in fact get married to Koestler until 1950, but they lived together from 1945. Here is my aunt Mame Paget with their beloved sheepdog. They always had dogs and they loved dogs. The bigger the better. This is the two of them at the window at Bolhochen. You can see the mountains of Snowdonia behind. It's a very beautiful place. And you see the two of them at their dining table with the mountains of Snowdonia behind them. Here, by the way, is a photograph of my mother, who was sad.
Well, you're cooking on gas now.
This is the farmhouse itself.
Yep, I can see that.
Okay, this is again Arthur and Mame. So after that pretty busy and hectic Christmas, Celia and Orwell returned to London, but as you know, as Ken has told us, on the 2nd of May, Orwell wrote to Arthur with the first draft of this manifesto, which Arthur then replied on the 9th of January, saying that they very much hope to get Russell on board. He said, "I've had 2 long talks with Russell. He agrees with our aims, but not with our method of approach. He thinks it's too late to start some sort of ethical movement, that war will be on us soon," interestingly, and that more direct political action is necessary to prevent it. Also, he is tired and overworked. As to the League, he would nevertheless be with us, but not as an initiator, as he wishes to be a passive figurehead and has no time to take an active part. To sum up, he is frightened of the burden of work, but at the same time very anxious to do something. So then Ken has really covered the months going forward. They desperately tried to get, but failed really to get Russell on board. And they lost the support, very sadly, of both Humphrey Slater, who was the editor of Polemic magazine, which George Orwell was a frequent contributor to, and also the financial backing of Rodney Phillips, the publisher of Polemic magazine. And that was a very bitter blow indeed. So the conference that they had been planning to hold in Wales over Easter was then had to be completely abandoned. They had to cancel all the hotel rooms, which they had booked in all the local hotels, and it was a bitter blow. Russell finally, as Ken mentioned, opted out really in May, and thereafter, the next person that they approached, or that Arthur approached, was Victor Gollancz, sending the position along with Russell's collaboration removed at Russell's insistence, and trying to persuade him to give them the support that they hitherto lacked. They wanted an organising committee, they wanted office space. They claimed, or he claimed, that once it got rolling, it would roll by itself, because there were various people in France, in Italy, and the US who were only waiting for the initial spark to come in wholeheartedly either. And as far as I'm aware, the petition really sort of hit the ground at the end of that summer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ariane. The pictures were wonderful. I'm glad you showed them to us.
Thanks.
Thank you. Les, please.
Thank you. Sometime in 1944, particularly, that's after he'd left the BBC, George Orwell had become particularly worried about threats to human rights, threats to democratic rights, and the abuse of police powers. This particularly concerned him as he went through 1944, 1945, and he'd become involved with the Freedom Press Defence Committee, which became the Freedom Defence Committee. Now, despite the fact that that organisation was to continue until 1949, he also became involved with what was possibly intended to be a much more international organisation, the one we're discussing today, the one that he planned with Koestler and Bertrand Russell. It's discussed over a couple of pages in Bernard Crick's this manifesto and possible international committee. Is discussed in Bernard Crick's 1980 biography. It's mentioned in Michael Scammell's biography of Koestler. And then the manifesto, in some form or another, was for the first time ever printed in David Smith's book in 2018. Now, what is the reason that Orwell and Koestler were concerned? He said, "I haven't found anything significant about the League of the Rights of Man. No one seems to have much about it in their files. All that I can discover is that it's still in existence in France and that it did exist in Germany up to Hitler. So it must have been an international organization." He says there's something about it in Wells's Crooks and Sartor, which I can't get hold of. So it's possible that it drew up the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which Wells is always burbling about. as he wrote in a letter to Arthur Koestler on the 10th of January 1946. Now, Orwell here already has got things round his neck because he's confusing two completely different books. Wells's Crux Ansata, his indictment of the Roman Catholic Church for its support of the fascists and the Nazis, with its great opening line, "Why aren't we bombing Rome?" with Wells's much more significant book, The Rights of Man, which probably had a big influence on the 1948 declaration of the Universal Declaration of Rights of Man from the United Nations. So already the group of men had separated themselves from the movement which was moving through Wells towards the United Nations. But let's look back, and as Dr. Blackwell has said, where did Orwell and Russell views coincide? Well, particularly in George Orwell's review of Power, A New Social Analysis, which appeared in the Adelphi in January 1939. If there are certain pages of Bertrand Russell's book Power which seem rather empty, that's merely to say that we've now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men. Russell pointed out that at present the rule of naked force obtains almost everywhere. Probably that has always been the case. Where this age differs from those immediately preceding it is that the liberal intelligentsia is lacking. Now, in the review elsewhere, he does call Russell a liberal, and he goes on to condemn him, saying he merely utters what amounts to a pious hope that the present state of things will not endure. He's inclined to point to the past, that tyrannies sooner or later collapsed. There's no reason to suppose that Hitler more permanent than his predecessors. But of course, this was not Orwell's own belief. The peculiar horror of the present moment is that we cannot be sure that this is so. It's quite possible that we're descending into an age in which 2 and 2 will make 5 when the leader says so. This, of course, will become significant in Orwell's thinking. Orwell is going to restate it in his 1943 essay, looking back on the Spanish War, part 4, very prescient, and it will ultimately become one of the themes of the novel 1984, published in 1949. Orwell points this the consequence of one of the sources of this. One's only to think of the sinister possibilities of the radio, state-controlled education and so forth, to realize that the truth is great and will prevail is a prayer rather than an axiom, where he's quoting Thomas Jefferson. Nevertheless, Orwell was very impressed. Russell is one of the most readable of living writers. It's very reassuring to know that he exists. Few people during the past 30 years have been so consistently impervious to the fashionable bunk of the moment. In a time of universal panic and lying, he is a good person to make contact with. There's the book Power, A New Social Analysis by Bertrand Russell. It was published in October 1938 and was so popular that a reprint had to be made only a month later. In his review, Orwell said that the first chapters of the book were better than the later ones. The impulse to power, leaders, forms, priestly, kingly, revolutionary. Revolutionary power, of course, Orwell would himself condemn in his letters to Dwight MacDonald, discussing the background to Animal Farm. Where did Russell and Orwell's ideas coincide? In his autobiography, Russell said, "My next piece of work was Power, A New Social Analysis. Freedom is still desirable even in a socialist state, but this sphere has to be defined afresh and in liberal terms." The thesis in this book appears to me important. It was intended as a refutation both of Marx and the classical economists, not on a point of detail, but on the fundamental assumptions that they shared. I argued that power rather than wealth should be the basic concept in social theory, and that social justice should consist in equalization power to the greatest practical degree. I'm afraid that I can't do a Russell voice in reading this out. He argued, it followed that state ownership of land and capital was no advance unless the state was democratic, and even then only if methods were devised for curbing the power of officials. A part of my thesis was taken up and popularized in James Burnham's Managerial Revolution. Otherwise, the book fell rather flat. I still hold, however, that what it says of saying is of great importance if the evils of totalitarianism are to be avoided, particularly under a socialist regime. And again, as Orwell wrote to some of his commentators why he'd made the subject of 1984 INGSOC, English socialism, that he thought that the totalitarian abuse of socialism was greater than the totalitarian expression of conservatism and fascism. In fact, Russell brings out one element within his book Power in chapter 10, where he talks about creeds, that is to say, the religious element. But it's within that where we come across, after that reference to James Burnham, who of course was to have a major element in Orwell's thinking and to be the subject of 2 refutatory essays by Orwell, that apart from James Burnham, we come across a footnote within Power, where Russell says, on this subject, see the very interesting chapter, Fog of Skepticism over Russia, in Eugene Lyon's book, Assignment in Utopia. After telling of the enthusiasm of the launch of the 5-year plan, I watched skepticism spread like a thick, wet fog. Quoting still from Eugene Lyons, men who published and spent all their time pumping up optimism talk bitterly in private of the planlessness of the plan, the terrible wastage of substance. Draconic decrees were invented almost weekly to discipline and repress the common worker. One of them made a single day's absence for work punishable by loss of job, bread book, living space, tantamount to a sentence of slow death. And of course, what we're actually, here we go. And Russell is so keen that he quotes another chapter of Eugene Lyons, People Under Dictatorship Condemned to a Lifetime of Enthusiasm. And that, of course, is what Julia takes up, the character within 1984. There's one of the covers that was used for Eugene Lyons' book, the 2 + 2 = 5 poster, which had been used to promote the 5-year plan. Let's do the 5 years in 2 + 2, 4 years. Now, what we actually have is that Orwell also reviewed Assignment in Utopia in June 1938. That's to say, a few months before he reviewed Power by Bertrand Russell. The years that Mr. Lyons spent in Russia were years of appalling hardship, culminating in the Ukraine famine in 1933. No doubt, after the success of the second 5-year plan, the physical conditions have improved, but there seems no reason for thinking that the social atmosphere is greatly different. Now, here again is where we'll discover that Orwell disagrees with Russell's reading. In the picture Mr. Lyons presents, I do not believe he does not misrepresented the facts. He does, however, show signs of being embittered by his experience, and I think he probably exaggerates the amount of discontent prevailing among the Russians themselves, which is possibly not Russell's own position. Now, as Ariane has mentioned, the committee, the League for the Freedom and Dignity of Man of Koestler and Russell, never really took place. Orwell and had been working with the Freedom Defence Committee, meanwhile, in parallel, supporting it. Nevertheless, that had taken up the work, which I think Bernard Crick alludes to when he says that the Russell-Orwell, the Koestler-Russell-Orwell committee ultimately led to organizations such as the Amnesty International. But in fact, that is what had been done by the Freedom Defence Committee. It was they who were appealing to governments, both national and international, on behalf of individuals. There are references to this and synopses of what they were doing in their bulletins, where the synopses are published in Peter Davison's edition of Orwell Complete Works. Nevertheless, by the 7th of September 1948, the Freedom Defence Committee had to make an appeal, pointing out that vigilance is an activity involving time, energy and money. The Freedom Defence Committee was set up to uphold the essential liberty of individuals and organisations and to defend those who are persecuted for exercising their rights to freedom of speech, writing and action. Again, this much later actions of organisations such as Amnesty International. But to enable our work to go forward, therefore, we need an immediate sum of at least £500. Our basic requirements are modest enough. 1,000 regular subscribers at a guinea a year, but we're also in desperate need of lump sum donations to enable us to pay our debts and keep our office open. They had one office, which was probably one room in Ensley Street in London, but they didn't have enough funds, for instance, to own the Roneo machine, which they were hoping, and it sounds as if it already through, that Polemic would supply. You may ask yourself why, after the success of Animal Farm, Orwell couldn't supply these this £500. And the reason is quite simple, that even in the first year of the publication of Animal Farm, Orwell only made £79. He simply didn't have it. Russell didn't have it. Koestler didn't have it. Nevertheless, where can we see some more coincidences of the thinking of Russell and Orwell? Well, if we look much forward to the publication of 1984, in 1949, there on one page we'll see that Winston owns a book called The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein. I can't help feeling that it will, in Russell, it will have called up a memory of a book he wrote in 1920 called The Practice and Theory of Bolshevism. Very similar titles. It may have stayed in Orwell's mind. We move on to the last page of 1984, where Winston Smith writes a formula on the table. 2 + 2 = 5. And this is from scanned from my first edition of 1984. And I move on to something that I'm sure that our colleagues from the Russell Society will recognize. This is the 1910 Principia Mathematica by Whitehead and Russell, and on page 382, they finally define that 1 + 1 = 2. Whether this is all coincidence, I can't tell you, but the fact is that what we do find is that, at least in some of the forms that Orwell expressed himself, he probably already thought of 2 + 2 = 5, as we saw he mentions in Power. That idea, as Peter Davison in The Complete Works points out, had already occurred in works of Lawrence Stern and Fyodor Dostoevsky. But nevertheless, what it does indicate is that we had, in 3 figures, Russell the mathematician, Koestler trained as an engineer, and Orwell the polymath, 3 great minds who would simultaneously share many ideas, even while recognizing that some of them they were at variance on. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Les. Could everybody unmute now and show their appreciation for our excellent speakers?
Thank you, Les.
Thank you.
I think we'd all agree this has been a wonderful evening, and I'd like to thank especially our 3 speakers, and to Chris and those behind the scenes who did all the organisation to make this possible. I hope we can meet you all again, the Russell Society. At some point, we'll find another subject we can work on together. It's been a real pleasure to meet you all tonight.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
organizing.
Everyone.
And don't be shy. If anybody wants to speak up and explain what the benefits of being a member of the Russell Society are, please do. And then I'll reciprocate and say a little bit about the Orwell Society. Adam, would you like to?
Sure. So the Russell Society has an annual membership. As part of membership, you become a voting member of the Bertrand Russell Society. You're able to participate in the annual general meetings. That includes making presentations on conferences. And we've had a lot of kind of interdisciplinary stuff like what we've been seeing today. I don't think it's unique, but it's always worthy to note that if you've got a society based around titans like Orwell, Russell, and Koestler, you can pretty much talk about anyone and you'll find that Russell or Orwell or Koestler had some connection to them or certainly something to say about them. You also get access to Russell, which is the Journal of Bertrand Russell Studies. You can see a whole mess of them over there that I've got. That has been ably edited by Ken Blackwell for 50 years, a little over 50 years. We had quite a moment when the editorship finally passed on. If anything can be said on it briefly, it's that it seems just about everything Russell related is defined by longevity and permanence, and that certainly applies to Ken's able editorship as well. If you have any questions about that, I'll put the email to the Bertrand Russell Society email that comes to me if you have further questions, and to any and all in the Orwell Society. It was an absolute treat talking with all of you. This has been a conference that we had in the work for many months, and it turned out absolutely beautifully. So I have to just echo what our friends at the Orwell Society said in saying, I certainly hope this isn't the last collaborative event that we all do together. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, for the Orwell Society is a much younger society. We've been going only 11 years. We publish 2 journals a year. We have a very well stocked with all sorts of resources website that Les Hurst curates. As he mentioned, we have a presence on social media. It's been my pleasure throughout the existence of the society to organize events for members. These include every other year we go to Jura and have privileged access to Barn Hill. We go to Spain to the sites of homage to Catalonia, where again we get to places that nobody else does. For example, on the roof of the Polyarama, where my father parked Orwell and a few others during the May Day events. And I've just come back with Richard Blair, Orwell's son, and Kevin Carter, who's done a lot of research, and our wives, so that we will be in a position, having followed up on Kevin's research, we can offer a visit to Morocco for a week at the beginning of November next year, which will enable you to see some of the locations around where he wrote coming up for air. So it's a modest fee. Overseas members get all of that for their currency equivalent of £30. UK members, it's £20, and those figures haven't changed since we launched the society. So thank you very much, and look forward to another one of these events in the future. And good night, everybody.